Good afternoon. Are you enjoying the weather? So I'm excited. I'm quite delighted to introduce our guest for today. With us, we have Dr. Almeda Wright, who is no stranger to Yale. She is currently Assistant Professor of Religious Education at Yale Divinity School. Prior to her arrival at Yale, she served for 4 years as Assistant Professor of Religion and Youth Ministry at Pfeiffer University, and before that, an adjunct faculty member at Candler School of Theology at Emory University. Her research focuses on African American religion, adolescent spiritual development, and the intersections of religion and public life. Dr. Wright is ordained in the American Baptist Church. She also served as co-editor with Mary Elizabeth Moore of Children, Youth, and Spirituality in a Troubling World, served as editor of an issue of Practical Matters Journal, and has now released a book entitled The Spiritual Lives of Young African Americans. But Almeda is more than a colleague, but also a faithful friend that shares her brilliance, wisdom, humor, and support beyond the walls of the academy. With her is Nyle Fort. Mr. Fort is a minister, organizer, and scholar based in Newark, New Jersey. Nyle has worked in the fields of education, criminal justice, and youth development for nearly a decade in various capacities. He recently traveled to Ferguson, Missouri to help build the movement for Black Lives Matter. Nyle is currently a PhD student in Religion and African American Studies at Princeton University and a Ford Predoctoral Fellow. From my own interaction, I've found Nyle to be a brilliant, down-to-earth scholar activist that is passionate about social movements. His own research on the politics of mourning is bound to contribute to current theological discourses on the intersection of lament and agency. Will you join me in welcoming our guest today?
Good afternoon. Okay, I'm Black and I'm Baptist, so when I say good afternoon, I need you to talk to me like you finished chewing your chicken and it was good. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Thank you. It is truly an honor to be with you all today, to be able to share. And it's also interesting that somehow or another I always end up at the end of the semester, maybe I schedule it this way or maybe I just don't, Sarah doesn't like me enough to get me here earlier, but it's all right. It's hard to imagine that it's already been a year since I have shared with you with Dr. Ann Wimberly, and we were here sharing from our research on joy in and across African American life, religion, culture, and history. And in that research, we began to wrestle with the historical dimensions of Black joy and how cultural memory helps youth and young adults, and even adults, embrace lives of joy and flourishing. But we also began to think about the components and characteristics of this historical Black joy. In that research, we summarized, and I want to bring us back to this definition of joy. We summarized that Black joy, or joy in African American culture and history, was multidimensional. In particular, we looked at 5 different components. Black joy is searched for and yearned for, and that people want to see, to envision, to experience joy in the midst of, but also beyond, life's trials and tribulations. We named that Black joy is expressed, embodied, and encountered. In other words, joy is not simply expressed orally or verbally. It is expressed, embodied, and encountered in music and dance, smiles, shouts, hugs, food, and laughter shared between loved ones and strangers, as the result of religious, celebratory, and overcoming critical life experiences. We also named that Black joy is cultivated and chosen. In spite of all that rails against joy, people make a conscious decision to enter into what they envision and expect to be joy-promising, joy-infusing experiences, often with and invited by God. Black joy is also resistance and justice. Joy is a way of being and triumphing or having
the last word in the face of wounding, life-negating, life-taking systems, structures, and society that say Black people are not worthy of life, let alone to enjoy it. Black joy is also intergenerational, communal, eco-connected, and transcendent. It's a mouthful, but we named that Black joy was both vertical and horizontal, that it had vertical and horizontal dimensions, and that joy doesn't happen in isolation. It's not a one-directional experience. It happens horizontally in relationships and in mutual exchanges across generations and in community and with the natural world. It happens vertically in relationship to God, in response to God's invitation to lean, to trust, to call on God, and to step out on God's word. So while we keep this multi-dimensional definition and nature of Black joy in mind, this past year, our research has taken me further into the ways that joy is often chosen and cultivated. Yes, I've wrestled with how joy, particularly among African American youth, is chosen, with how we might invite youth and young adults into experiencing joy for themselves or in seeing joy as an option. How do we invite them into seeing joy as a possibility, as an option that they can choose in spite of all that life throws at them and in their way? And while we could spend the entire lecture speaking or unpacking about what it means to choose joy and Western dimensions of choice and things like that, instead for today, we're going to wrestle with some of the important dimensions of choosing joy and some of the allied or parallel skills that youth and young adults need in order to choose or experience joy. In particular, today we're looking at agency. Now, what is agency? And why is it important for adolescent flourishing? And why is it important to empower young people in their agency in order for them to experience joy? Now, of course, we don't choose easy topics because like joy, agency is another one of those concepts that defies easy definition or articulation. However, without rehearsing, because there are about 12,000 books and that many more scholarly essays and a couple about 63 pages long that give you the definitions and the history of all the quandaries that sociologists and psychologists have with agency, just looking at adolescents, and we don't even get to the adults. I want to give you a Cliff Notes version or a quick definition that we're going to use today. So for us, agency can be simply understood as a belief in one's self-regulative capability to attain goals, or the capacity of individuals to act independently and to make their own free choices. Even in these simple definitions, we see a lot that needs to be unpacked. Agency, first and foremost, is often described in individual and personal terms, deriving from our theorizing about a singular agent or actor. However, there is also collective and social agency to contend with, as well as another debate in the social sciences that is relevant to our time today of agency versus structure or structures, where social scientists for years have wrestled with trying to determine to what extent our social structures or our social systems, including things like class, sex, gender, race, etc., affect one's agency or one's ability to act independently. However, looking specifically at ethnic minority youth and young adults and their communities, I recognize several potential pitfalls that we need to kind of put in here, flag, footnote, whatever you like to call it. Often when we discuss structures and systems, we downplay or overlook the agency of Black and brown youth and young adults in the face of immense social structures and systems. And it's important to note fully the power of oppressive structures and systems and the impact of years of oppression on individuals and on communities. However, without also discussing means of cultivating agency, and without a genuine belief in one's ability to act and to make choices, even in the face of structures and systems which are rigged against their success, flourishing for minority youth and young people is a non-starter. In other words, we have to say, even in the face of conversations about agency and structures of oppression, that all youth, all young adults have agency. All have the ability to make decisions which affect their life outcomes, even in the harshest and most oppressive situations. And it's our work as youth leaders and concerned adults to help them cultivate that agency. Now, we cannot downplay their agency, and we must remember instructors and people I've been studying and listening to for years, early liberation educators and organizers like Septima Clark and Paulo Freire, because they emphasize the necessity of believing in and trusting the people to be agents and actors in their own liberation and success. Part of Freire's discussion of the process of humanization or overturning dehumanization was to see ourselves and others as capable of creating change in our own lives. That is step number one. You can't start a revolution unless you believe that revolution is possible and you can be a revolutionary. Agency resists attempts at both dehumanization and rendering others powerless or making people feel as if they are powerless. Similarly, my shero, Septima Clark's success in training an entire generation of disenfranchised Black Southerners to read and write so that they could register to vote rests in her inherent belief that they were capable not only of basic literacy, but full participation in their communities and in the government. She believed that they could be trained to be full citizens. She trusted them to be agents of social transformation. Now, this belief, though, has to be expanded to youth and young adults. Freire and Clark were working primarily with adults. And sometimes even those adults that they were empowering would look at the next generation and say, well, it's fine for us to learn, but y'all need to be seen and not heard. See, our belief in the people has to be expanded to youth and young adults so that we never overlook the capacities of youth to fully participate in their lives and contribute to their communities and worlds right now. The hardest thing that I have to tell parents and adults and teachers and well-meaning older people is that young people are capable now. Not waiting in the wings, not waiting to be trained, not standing on the sidelines, waiting for you to give them. They are not like waiting for double dutch, because I used to love double dutch. They are not standing there just waiting for their turn, but they're capable now to be in there and to actually be turning the ropes. Several religious educators and youth workers have noted the ways that in the U.S. in particular, we have, in the words of David White, domesticated adolescents, pushing them to the sidelines of adult life and worlds. And while we don't want youth to have to take on undue or unfair adult responsibilities too soon, that is a fear and a concern, we need to recognize the capacities of youth and young adults. Likewise, we must recognize the differences that youth from ethnic minority communities experience in terms of responsibility and assumption of adult roles already. See, I'm reminded of several poems, because I've been reading a lot of poetry lately, listening to a lot of spoken word lately, by ethnic minority youth and young women who share from their collective experiences of so many non-dominant youth and young adults when they describe the responsibilities that they have had to take on as middle schoolers and teens. And so I want us to take a little time, about 3 minutes, it's a short piece, and listen to the words of one young woman today. So, what does agency look like What does joy, what does flourishing look like for Nova and many others like her? Honestly, to me, she is the epitome of youth agency. When we pay attention carefully to what they're capable of, but also what they are burdened with already. She is the epitome of youth agency. She reminds adults and her peers through her creative arts that these are her experiences and that she has been making choices about how she would care for her brother in spite of the inadequacies of the adults around her. She demonstrates agency in choosing to not only live this, but to share part of her life in creative art. Speaking to and with other youth and to the larger society, reminders of the health disparities in many ethnic minority communities, as well as reminding religious people, reminding us that often our platitudes about God don't make sense in the life of lived realities of the people around us. Nova reminds us of the role of agency and making choices that might appear resistant to the stereotypes of young adults while pointing to herself, and she's facing head on the reality that she is being expected to be mother and father to her brother long before her more privileged counterparts might even have a part-time job or a student government position. As concerned adults, we must be aware of these differences and intentional about cultivating the agency of youth and young adults across the spectrum in the U.S. Catherine Turpin and Ann Carter Walker, in their book, Nurturing Different Dreams, which I recommend to all of you, reminds us that agency for youth, particularly minority and non-dominant youth, looks different and can often take on an oppositional or resistant stance or character. Agency is connected to identity, or one's sense of who one is or who one will become, as well as who people, society, etc. expect you to be. Agency is also intricately connected to resisting attempts to prescribe or limit this sense of who and what I can do and be. For example, Walker and Turpin give examples of students who were already having to contribute to their families economically and through childcare chores, and resisting the middle class narratives that adolescence is simply a time for preparation for the future, where students simply pass through classes without fully considering what contributions they could make to their own lives now. Instead, some of the students resisted and protested the expectations with positive and negative outcomes. That's also the side of agency. Sometimes it has positive and sometimes it has negative outcomes, but you made choices. But in either case, they demonstrated their agency in the matter. Catherine Turpin writes, "Youth agency, whether developed in authorized or unauthorized forms, serves a key function in helping young people grow into their full sense of vocation. Attending to the multiple sites of agency of development among non-dominant youth requires movement beyond typical understandings of entitlement to consider practices of resistance and collective agency in new ways. Often, that agency enlivens to fulfill dreams that may be distinctive from those of their adult mentors." Well, for me, I always ask the question, so what does this mean for all of us? How do we help youth cultivate these various forms of agency? And in particular, where should we be looking in order to take seriously the variety of agency that youth and young adults have and are demonstrating right now? And one of the places where my work and my research has taken me is to youth and young adult activism. And so when I think of, particularly among Black youth and ethnic minority youth, where they're experiencing and exhibiting both joy and agency, looking at this intersection, I see it here. When I think of agency and its manifestations among youth and young adults, I most often think of their work in their communities. I think of their collective agency in resisting even the attempts to domesticate them or attempts to make them spectators in their own lives. Over the past few years, we have observed more and more of our students resisting this passive image of adolescence by participating in acts of resistance and civil disobedience. And one of my favorite examples actually took place in a Chicago high school a few years ago, where the mayor of Chicago visited an esteemed high school where he usually gets a warm reception and where the students represent the success stories of urban youth with 100% graduation rates and college acceptance rates. And instead of standing to recite the school's creed, as they were asked to do, they started chanting 16 shots. 16 shots. It became a type of rallying cry, and I argued a well-timed exhibit of their collective agency. Now, if one of them had done it, he would have probably been suspended. But all of them doing it together, they knew that there was some collective agency there. But why? Why would these good kids decide to chant against the mayor instead of standing to recite the school's creed? They were protesting, of course, the fatal police shooting of 17-year-old Laquan McDonald and calling for the mayor's resignation for delaying and possibly covering up information that could have led to the indictment of Officer Jason Van Dyke. But more than this specific chant and protest, these well-behaved and respectable young people made a conscious choice to participate in a larger and longer legacy of civil disobedience in order to bring attention to injustices around them. In truth, the frustrations and outrage at the system and structures which continue to oppress minority youth and young adults in the U.S. offers us many snapshots of the role of agency in adolescence and demonstrates where and how we see youth participating in their larger communities, not simply making decisions or choices which will affect their individual lives alone, but also to see how they're trying to think about how is the larger society encroaching on my individual life, and how am I going to transform that too? See, the last 7 to 10 years demonstrate an uptick in youth activism and in political engagement in some ways, but also a resurgence. We've seen a resurgence of a type of activism across actual socioeconomic classes and points to an increased interest even in things like community organizing. If you teach a course here at Yale Divinity School on community organizing, it is always oversubscribed because of what's happening in our society, in our lives. We've seen things from protests starting years ago with like Occupy Wall Street or Black Lives Matter, or even most recently March for Our Lives. And these are things that are not just one-offs. They're now becoming part of the historical markers and movements of this generation of youth and young adults. However, as a Christian, practical theologian, my work also forces me to ask or wrestle with not only what's going on in society in general, but to look specifically at how and what examples of youth agency we see in Christian communities, or what examples of Christian agency we see in the larger community. And to wrestle with questions of how faith connects with or does not connect with questions of agency and adolescent flourishing. So I went looking not only for examples of youth and young adults who were exemplifying agency and activism, but to see where or how this activism and agency was inspired by or inspiring their faith. And therefore, part of my research was to provide snapshots of Black Christian youth activists, not as a dominant. Now, be very careful what I'm saying here. This is not the dominant way or the dominant place that you are going to see activists. They are not going to be in youth group. I know, I'm sorry. To break the news to you. Often, though, what you will see is, and so I had to look, in some ways, Nyle and I were talking about this the other day, I have to somewhat shake the trees to find where are the examples of activists who are also Christian or Christians who are also activists. They should not be oxymoronic terms. But the reality is, as I looked at the array of youth activism, the landscape was full. You did have some young people who adamantly said, no, Christianity really isn't for me, and that's okay. And that's an interesting demographic, some would say a growing demographic, but we also see generations of young activists who are spiritual in their understanding or Christian in their background, and then others who are explicitly naming their faith as why they are doing this work, or explicitly naming their faith as what sustains them in doing this works. So it includes others who took on a mantle and began protesting. People and we had, a couple years ago, I was just going through the headlines, and we had people like the young man, Jonathan Butler, at Missouri, or University of Missouri, or Mizzou, and he, in order to demand change on that campus, he participated in a hunger strike. In all of his interviews, if you didn't pay attention to this, he's quoting about how he was praying and fasting and how this is what he did to prepare him to fight this entrenched racism on his campus. But we also see it in figures like Bree Newsom, who is best known for scaling the flagpole in South Carolina to remove the Confederate flags days after 9 people were massacred in Emmanuel AME Church. And Bree stood out to me because of the way that she publicly quoted Psalms and scripture as she was climbing the pole, as she was coming down, and offering youth and young adults another model of Black public faith and witness. The landscape also includes other people like young seminarians. This is down at Candler School of Theology, but we have many pictures like that from YDS as well. Participating on campuses across the country, sponsoring die-ins or marching to protest the names of buildings which reflect part of their school's history that is both offensive and unacknowledged. These groups also coalesced around issues such as racial profiling and harassment by campus police and cultures of sexual abuse on campuses. In other words, there are a wealth of examples, if we but look, of Black youth and minority and non-minority youth activism and protest just from the past few years. So what we're doing here today is offering you that snapshot. And so I'm also privileged and excited to bring up now my colleague in this venture, Nyle Fort, who for me embodies some of the best of this. He writes about and talks about being radicalized as a seminarian. Most people are like, really? You go to seminary to learn how to use your agency and protest? Yes. So, I know, much to your pastor's chagrin. But let me stop here so that Nyle can share more of his work.
What's up, everybody? How y'all doing? Everybody ate already? Get your food? Okay, all right. I don't want to compete with the food because I can't do that. I would like to thank Yale Divinity School, the Youth Ministry Institute, the Center for Faith and Culture. I would like to thank you, Skip, for just being amazing and so hospitable to me. Skip took us out to this dinner last night. Y'all been to Adriana's? Is that what it's called? Oh, my God. I'm mad y'all didn't tell me about it. I know y'all don't know me, but it was amazing. So thank you for everything. Dr. Farmer, thank you for the introduction. Thank you for being also so hospitable. To Suzanne Dos Santos, who's over there, I believe, who also just did so much to get me here. And of course, to Dr. Wright for working with me while I'm trying to finish my general exams. I really appreciate you. I come out of the Black church tradition, and I'm also a hip hop baby. So that means I believe in a call and response. So that means if I'm talking and nobody says anything back, I'm gonna think you don't like me. And my mama is live streaming, and if my mom knows y'all don't like me, she's not gonna like you. And you don't want a Black mama not to like you. Can we shout out my mama real quick? Just say, hey, Ma. Hey, Ma. Thank you so much. 2 months after I graduated from seminary, white police officer Darren Wilson shot and killed 18-year-old Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri. It was 2014, and the country was about to be rocked by arguably the most dramatic people's movement since the 1960s. I had planned on spending the following year applying to PhD programs. I'm the first in my family to go to college, so just the idea and the opportunity to get a doctoral degree is a big deal for my family and for myself. Thank you, all right, there we go, call and response. But I had to ask myself, what would it mean for me to get a doctoral degree while people who look like me are being gunned down in the streets by those who are sworn to protect and serve? And what does it mean for me, a person of faith, to study religion in an ivory tower while black people are being sacrificed on the altar of white supremacy every single day in this country. I wasn't okay with pursuing an American dream while so many live an American nightmare. So I got on a bus and I went to Ferguson to not only protest police brutality, but to do what I believe is God's will, to speak truth to power, to fight for freedom and justice. Michael Brown was no anomaly, of course. According to one report, a black person is killed by either a police officer or a vigilante, that is someone acting as a police officer, every 28 hours in the United States of America. So it's important to understand that Michael Brown's murder wasn't a case of bad apples, but actually the strange fruit of a tree rooted in white supremacy. Just weeks before Michael Brown's murder, Eric Garner was choked to death by the NYPD officer Daniel Pantaleo for allegedly selling loosies. Garner spoke for so many black Americans when he gasped 11 times, "I can't breathe." Y'all know it. This epidemic of racialized state violence has a long history in this country, from slavery and lynchings to Jim Crow and mass incarceration. James Cone, who transitioned this week to be with God and to be with the ancestors, wrote in his classic text, what I call a classic text, even though it's more recent, "The Cross and the Lynching Tree," quote, "Every time a white mob lynched a black person, they lynched Jesus," end quote. The state-sponsored execution of Jesus can be directly linked, I believe, both theologically and politically, to the execution of black people in America. The question for me when I was doing my activism in Ferguson was very simple. What is the church's response to the deaths of Amadou Diallo, Chantel Davis, Michael Brown, Eric Garner, Renisha McBride, Trayvon Martin, Sean Bell? I can go on and on and on, but we only have but so much time. For many churches, the responses were at best prayer and at worst silence. On the bus ride back from Ferguson, that silence haunted me. I needed to do something, more than prayer, more than a moment of silence, but I struggled to name a church where I could articulate my rage, my righteous indignation in the face of racial injustice. I began to think about Cone and of that rich tradition of black liberation theology and of my own growing up in the church. I remembered the many 7 last word services I had been to and how, in my eyes, Good Friday, not Easter Sunday, and y'all can fight me after if you want, but it's Good Friday, not Easter Sunday, that always felt like the highlight of the black church calendar. And for those who don't know, 7 last word services are services that are organized on Good Friday, where preachers come together and preach the words of Jesus according to Scripture. As I sat on the bus back from Ferguson, an idea came to me to remix the traditional 7 last words service, and instead of preaching the last words of Jesus, to preach the last words of black people killed by police. We called the service Strange Fruit Speaks, in honor of Billie Holiday's soulful rendition of the song. I want to go home. These were the last words of Renisha McBride. She was 19 years old, looking for help after a car accident, when she knocked on Theodore Wafer's door. She never got help. She got a bullet instead. "Mom, I want to go to college." These were the last words of Amadou Diallo. He was 23 years old, an immigrant, shot 41 times because he, quote, fit the description. "I love you." These were the last words of Sean Bell, shot 50 times by the NYPD after leaving his own bachelor party. He wore the same suit to his funeral that he was supposed to wear to his wedding. We held the first service at Shiloh Baptist Church, and when I say we, there was really a village that came together to make this happen. The idea came to me, but my brother, Lukata Mjumbe, who's my Morehouse brother, shout out to all the Morehouse or Spelman or HBCU folks. All right. Lucata and I came together and really put this together and got a group of folks together to do this. And we held the first service at Shiloh Baptist Church in Trenton, New Jersey. I want to talk to you a little bit about the last words that I preach, if that's all right. That's all right? I preached the last words of Jordan Davis. Anybody heard of Jordan Davis? No. Okay. Jordan was 17 years old. Him and his friends drove to a local gas station to get gum and cigarettes. As they sat in the car listening to music, probably the same kind of music that I listen to, hip-hop music, rap music, 47-year-old Michael Dunn became irritated after they refused to turn their music down. Michael Dunn then reached inside of his glove compartment and shot Jordan to death. Jordan's last words were, quote, "Fuck that nigga, turn that shit up." And I would like, if it's okay, to, and I forgot my phone up here, hold on one second. If it's all right, I would like to read so you get a little bit more context from the sermon. Is that all right? All right, just give me 1 second. The title of the sermon is The Blessing in the Curse. The Blessing in the Curse. If I were to take a poll asking the American church as a whole, whose side are you on, my friend? The answer would not be Jordan Davis. It would be, at best, silence, and at worst, Michael Dunn. What do I mean? I mean that the church, more often than not, and I'm not talking about every church. I know y'all go to the churches that don't do this. I mean that the church, more often than not, has a Michael Dunn ministry rather than a Jordan Davis message. How often does the church, like Michael Dunn, silence the voices and stereotype the culture of black youth because our music is too loud, and our pants too low, and our language too real? How often does the church, like Michael Dunn, murder the futures of black girls and boys who do not fit into the definitions of what white dominant society deems as holy, acceptable, and good? The hard truth today is that every time a black youth is not welcomed by the church because of the way we look, because of the way we talk, because of the way we dress, we are perpetuating the same pattern that took Jordan Davis's life. We are murdering our babies and doing so in the name of Jesus. Woe unto us. So that was just an excerpt from the sermon. And of course, it was a bit controversial, to say the least. But it was very important for me, for my brother Lucata, who helped co-organize this, to really treat the last words of these black people, these young black people, as sacred text. And so we couldn't censor that. We had to just, straight no chaser, talk about the stuff that I think the church ought to be talking about. What does this have to do with joy, you might be asking? Well, in so much of black life, joy and suffering are inseparable. That means we cannot talk about joy seriously without talking about the death-dealing conditions that impede on the very possibility of black joy and black life. Otherwise, I believe we miss the miracle of Jordan Davis's last words, that in staring in the face of death, Jordan insisted on turning that shit up. How we remember those crucified in our midst, how we mourn and memorialize them through song and dance and storytelling, is a kind of celebration, a kind of celebration. It is what I like to call a refusal to let death have the last word. A refusal to let death have the last word. So I was asked to give some practical steps. So I would like to conclude with that, and then I'm just gonna let Professor Wright continue to do her thing. Is that all right? Y'all with me? All right. Thank you, brother. Thank you, brother. So the first practical step and most obvious one is that you can do this Strange Fruit Speaks series yourself. The first one was held at Shiloh Baptist Church in Trenton, New Jersey, a large black church, local church, and I thought went very well. We had a lot of young people there, and we had a lot of young people there who never go to church. And I believe Jordan Davis's last words in particular made them at least go, what is going on here? I gotta go inside this church. And I've gotten reports that those young folks, some of them have continued to stay in the church. And so that's something that we can all do. Duke Divinity School did it, Drew did it, we did it at Riverside Church after, we did it at Shiloh Baptist Church, and so there's a lot of opportunities, whether you're a seminarian and want to organize this at your divinity school or at your seminary, whether you are a youth pastor and you want to organize this at your church, whether you're a volunteer and you want to bring this idea to your church. And I just ask that if this is something you would like to do, you can email me directly and I'll send you a toolkit and I can help you work through some of the details. And I'll give my email at the end. So that's the first practical step. How I'm doing, Skip? Because you said be practical. All right, that's one. Two, and this might sound a little less practical, but I'll try to get some concrete stuff around it, is political education. Political education, what do I mean? I was a youth pastor for 3 years while in seminary, and I was also being politicized at the same time. And everybody in seminary was like, you can't talk to them about this stuff. They too young. I was like, they live this. I can't talk to them about their actual lives. That's crazy to me. No, they get it, they live it, and they can theorize about it very sophisticatedly if we give them the space to do so. So some of the ways that I would do political education was, one, I would incorporate it in my sermons. I would incorporate it into the Bible studies that we would do weekly. I would also have study groups. So, for example, Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow had just dropped when I started youth pastoring. And so we read Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow alongside the Bible. They went hand in hand. We also had the young people in the congregation that I was serving writing letters to incarcerated young people, people their age who were encaged just down the street from the church. And so, this isn't just a national issue. Right here in New Haven, there has to be some juvenile detention centers. There has to be some young people who don't get to go to our congregations, and we can't forget about them. So political education. And the last thing on this point is using the arts. So film screenings, poetry and spoken word, which Professor Wright showed us a little bit of, street theater. These are all different things that you can use to not just raise awareness about the issue, but create opportunities for people to actually act on these issues. And the last one is not practical at all. I'm sorry, Skip. But it can be. It can be. The last one is to use your imagination. When I was on that bus ride back from Ferguson, I was a little scared about the idea because I was like, I don't even know how to talk to people about this. But really leaned into it and very happy that some folks encouraged me to do that because I believe that one of the major crises we're facing in the church is the crisis of imagination. And young people in particular, young black folk, young people of color, and young people in general have still this superpower that we tend to lose as we get older, which is to imagine something different. That's why kids do play, right? They make up worlds. That superpower is extremely important. And I think we have to find ways to cultivate that with and for our young people. And that's it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nyle. All we need to do now is just pass the collection plate and I can go home, or go on vacation and then go home. Now, the final thing, though, as we wrap up, and because I know we're right at time, is to think about or to ask questions. Because when I first encountered Nyle, I was striving. I think my sister was at Princeton Seminary and went to the first Strange Fruit Speaks, 7 Last Words at Shiloh, and she's great friends with Lucata. And so when we first encountered him, of course, my question was, the youth pastor and practical theologian question was, who formed Nyle? how do we cultivate another generation of Niles? Of how do we, like, I wanted to meet his mama, and actually, so if your mama want to talk to me about what she did, what went right, what went wrong, I will write that book. But some of that are the questions. Now, of course, we cannot imagine that we will have an entire youth group of Niles. We probably also would lose our mind because he asks way too many questions and pushes us too far sometimes. But there is a way that we must ask when we see exemplars of agency, exemplars of activism, exemplars of joy in spite of, that we also should ask what shaped them, but how might we cultivate agency in youth and young adults across the board? And so for us, I just wanted to leave us with a couple of strategies that instead of just talking to Nile's mama, we also need to learn from history. This is not the first generation of young people who were activists. We have young African-American children leading protests and participating in silent marches as early as 1912, protesting lynching and race riots in East St. Louis. We also need to listen radically. And ironically, I wrote this 350-some page book, and the thing that people have taken from this book is that I tell them to listen to young people. Listen without agendas. Listen not just to hear what they're saying so you can correct it, but listen to see what they're already saying, where they're already moving, where they're already hurting, and then together we create the agenda. Also, to learn with and from young agents of change. I said, you may not find young activists in your youth group, but guess what? You know where young activists are. Go there and listen. We also need to remind youth and young adult that they were created for joy. Often we say things like, as Christians, we're created for worship, we're created to do, interesting things, but we take off the table one of the things that sustains us as Christians, and that is joy. And so that's part of, when I think about how do we cultivate this, how do we help them walk into it, some of it is not rehearsing all the problems that are in their lives. That's not going to do it for us. But it's actually trying to work and walk with them as they're already responding to the situations and crises in their lives. And when we see agency, when we see them working for change, we need to learn to encourage it. So that's our final word for today. We appreciate you, but remember to tell every young person you encounter this week, you were created for joy. And I see the work that you're doing. Amen.
Can I have your attention? We want to go ahead and get started with our Q&A. And so if you have a question, we want to get it on live stream, which means you need to speak into the mic. And so I have a mic. And so does anyone have a question for Dr. Almeda Wright or Mr. Nyle Fort? If you have a question, please raise your hand.
Hi, I'm Rosalind Hamilton with Church of the Redeemer, Whitney and Cold Spring. So our conversation, we've had a lot of deep conversations, but one of our deep conversations has been at what age, and you keep referring to youth, but we have children who exemplify a lot of agency at 8, 9, and 10. So we're constantly trying to insert, language that includes children into the things that we expect and the things that we want and all of that. What do you think about ages like that?
That's important for us to, I appreciate your question. Thank you so much for that. But it's also important for us to recognize that children also have agency. Some of the best literature coming out of education and even the medical field
30, 40 years ago, started with the positive youth development movement. And part of what they were looking at there was for children and youth across the spectrum, looking at what were appropriate expectations for contributions to families, to communities, to society. And so you see this, and it's ironic that churches didn't really take on. Like you see this in terms of like elementary schools from kindergarten forward, that kids will have chores, kids will have like a little chore chart or something that they will need to participate in, like even from the earliest ages developmentally. So they would be learning to pour juice, and that was their job that day. They're gonna pour juice for everybody. And you think that's a small, minor thing, but that's the cultivation of agency. That's the cultivation of care and contribution to your community. And it's ironic that it hasn't been actually that long that we have domesticated children and youth to the point where we don't think about what their contributions are. And one of my colleagues down at Vanderbilt, Bonnie McLemore, even talks about the vocation of babies, how they actually, their babies' callings are to help adults be better people, to care better, to respond to need, and we don't even think about that that's what they're contributing to our family or our community at that moment, even from birth. That you've now actually made me a better human being because now I'm not selfish or as selfish. And so, so that just gives you the spectrum of the conversation today was specifically looking at youth and young adults, but it's not a limited one. So agency has to be, we have to think about and read through, and I can offer you other resources to help you think about what agency vocation looks like across the life cycle. And it's important for us to name that, and also to invite parents and congregations into that conversation so that they're not, Skip and I were just talking about it, completely domesticating their young people and their children so that then immediately you want to flip a switch when they become adults and expect them to contribute, and that's not how it works. It's got to be cultivated into that.
I'd be curious to hear you talk about counteracting apathy, in both in the sense of apathy from privilege and apathy from fatalism. Because the agency exists, but inspiring them, youth, to actually take hold of the agency.
And that's some of the stuff that you think about often when we're looking at agency. I'm not sure that I see agency and apathy as different ends of the spectrum as much as it can be part of the conversation. Also, I think sometimes from the outside looking in, adults, well-meaning middle-class adults, will often name apathy, certain types of agency and resistance and oppositional agency as apathy. One of the examples that Kathy Turpin gives in her book, Nurturing Different Dreams, was this idea that there were these girls who were already caring for family members, already holding down jobs. They were in high school. And one of the things that they would do is that they didn't really like any of the courses that they were supposed to be taking because they're like, this isn't preparing me for the future, let alone the reality that I currently have. And so the teacher said they must be apathetic because they're disengaged. What they were doing was creating alternative spaces. So they would scrapbook, they would work on makeup, and I'm like, these are not things that are going to help you, but they were operating in a type of agency that for all intents and purposes looked apathetic on the outside. But they were saying, we got to be here. They were, doing the Marshawn Lynch. I'm only here so I don't get fined. But they were not actually going to contribute into something that was not advancing their lives. Now, when a teacher intervened and actually worked with them to see what are the types of things that might be helpful, you saw them participate in a different way. But relationship, trust, knowledge had to kind of be thought about. And in terms of it, so that's one example. The other side of it, though, is I think that nihilism and apathy can be real because of the structural nature of not just oppression, but the way systems are kind of set up. So either it being us domesticating overly privileged children or us expecting or never allowing underprivileged children and youth to ever actually be children to have that respect. And so some of us, in terms of dealing with apathy, it's not just as agency is not just individual, but there's collective and a social element of it. We also have to think about what are the ways that we're contributing to some of the conditions that would lead to apathy and address those as well. Other questions?
I need to give a huge thank you for you calling out activism as an important part in our youth ministry, because that's not what you usually stereotypically would think you were going to come to hear. But I also need to say, and I don't usually give this extra invitation, but come to the Ministry Resource Center. We have shelves full of stuff on the arts and activism, which you called our attention to, and on activism with youth ministry. Cheers for that.
Hi, thank you both for the talk. I was hoping you could expand on when you talked about listening radically, and if there was any certain point where you had to take a look at your own listening skills.
Every day. No. I mean, we think we're good at it, but we really often are not very good listeners, because the way our brains work, but also the way society functions, that we're moving quickly. So often, even as you were asking your question, I was anticipating, how am I going to respond? And so that's a model of the fact that we don't listen very well. But in terms of specifically with my work with youth, I write about this in the book often, the ways that when I began to listen to teenagers, my research agendas had to change. So I came in, because I've been doing this work for years. Like I know I'm only 13 and a half, 27 or on my good days. I've been doing this work for a long, long time. Actually, I got into youth ministry when I was 17. And so I thought I knew kind of certain things that I needed to do, that young people needed me to do, but every generation and every individual young people presents a new case, a new situation, a new opportunity for me to either mess it up or get it right. And so I had to really begin to start with listening instead of driving with what I thought they needed. And so that really both changed ministry practices, but also changed, in addition, like what I was doing in terms of research. So I went in thinking, well, we're going to talk about spiritual development, faith formation, and this, that, and the other, when sometimes they were like, we feel like really close to God. We just feel kind of useless to the world. And I wouldn't have thought about those questions or even how to resource youth ministries to do that work. They're like, no, our churches have done discipleship all right. They haven't prepared me to be of service anywhere. And so having to listen and think through some of that stuff for me began to change. And so that also becomes one of, it's amazing the things that God gives you as happenstance. So it's like, I didn't go in to that being that was going to be the strategy that emerged, but that was one of the major gifts that they gave to me, but also one of the major gifts that the research is now giving to other people, that you really do have to be open to where they lead you, and that only begins by listening. So no, I still have not perfected it, but yes. Mm-hmm.
I just would like to add something briefly to that. I think a lot about assumptions that we make when we're listening to people, which is kind of a not listening, but those assumptions oftentimes silence. So let me get a concrete example. Young person comes to your congregation and is sleeping, falling asleep. There's several assumptions that can come from that. One could be, I'm boring, they don't like me, I gotta get cooler, they like the cool people who come but fall asleep on me. Another could be, this person just doesn't care about this, they care about other things. And there's a variety of other assumptions. Instead of making those assumptions, one thing that has been helpful for me, and I haven't always done this well, is to just ask questions. So to engage with that young person and say, hey, what's going on? I noticed this, not in a judgmental way at all, but a checking in. I just wanted to check in. I noticed this was happening, just wanted to check in. Are you all right? How's things at home? Because then with those types of questions, at least in my experience, they've revealed things about the situation that has made it much more complex and allowed for the relationship to deepen. So.
Hi, I'm Kiwi. Joint with your idea that kind of social action, justice, agency should be a Christian and spiritual issue, what would your vision for sort of education be? I went to an agricultural high school, which was often demoralized with being the farmer school and hicks and not very intelligent and low college and all that, but most of us left with these kinesthetic skills and this sense of usefulness to at least ourselves, if not to the world. And I know how much that has impacted me and how much I've seen it impact others. So I'm curious what your vision for education would be to go along with your vision of spiritual agency.
In some ways, you're speaking my language. My first life was as an electrical engineer. So I went to one of these vo-tech schools that, and because I didn't know what to do with a kid in rural Virginia who wanted to be an engineer. So they sent me, well, we got drafting over there at the vo-tech school. But it was, if most people don't get this, but engineering is science that actually wants to fix a problem, that actually wants to ask, like, so what? And so I remember always wrestling with that. And so for me, like religion, for me, education should always do something. It should always help people grow or wrestle with questions or ideas or contribute in particular ways. So those things have always been hand in hand for me. And I think also in terms of what we often talks about participatory education, or we talk about learner-centered education or different things like that. And some of that becomes just buzzwords when in reality, we need to go back to when they were emerging and what that looked like. So when I look at people like Frary and Septima Clark, who are educational gurus, what they're actually trying to cultivate in people are not esoteric knowledge, but they're trying to give people the knowledge that they need to actually be able to participate in society. At that particular point, it was literacy, math and writing. But also for Clark, most of the work went beyond just basic literacy to also think about how do I train these former like slaves and current sharecroppers how to read a tax bill, how to sign a check, how to, because literacy was one thing, but the goal was actual citizenship. And so that's the kind of stuff, when you think about educational models, we also need to think about, are we just looking at what's the outcome, what's the end goal? Is the end goal just standardization? Is it just passing a test? Or is it actually trying to prepare people to contribute fully or engage fully in the world that they have inherited?
Hi, my name is Tanisha, and I am a hairstylist who's all about changing the world of beauty and really working with the church and working with youth ministries, letting them know that as a hairstylist, beauty comes from God. And so they can have something to hold on to when they think of the word beauty. So I just wanted to know, like, how do you guys, how do you work that into what you do with the youth in your church or in your ministry?
One of the things that directly, leave us some cards because we want to talk about your health and beauty ministry. But the other side of it is that, all jokes aside, we, thinking about, and even the work we were doing last year with Dr. Ann, looking at places and ways of cultivating joy. Black joy often is, as we were talking about, an embodied thing. So aesthetics are important, not just personal appearance, but also where we see and experience beauty, how we create it. Some of the creative contributions that many of our young people are making, like whenever I go to a new city, I normally don't always have a stylist, but I know I can find a youth person that I've mentored who's gonna lead me to a stylist or still be able to braid my hair. And these are the random things that people are like, these are essential, by the way, as a black woman, when you go to a new city. You got to find a young person who can braid your hair. So these are, so what you're saying and what you're naming also is reminding us to look at or to think through what's important with young people and not to downplay aesthetics or downplay the creativity that many of them are naming as part of, not even if their primary vocation, but definitely part of what makes them them and what makes them kind of be able to interface with the world. And so I'm glad that you lift that up. In terms of practical things, I remember we just finished piloting a
the Black Joy curriculum down at Mount Airy Baptist Church, and one of the last things that we did was a vision board. So we were asking them to kind of like do their vision for their life, for their future, how they were going to choose joy. And interestingly enough, because we've got fashion magazines, we've got goals, they're pulling things that, you know, might be typical, but many of them also were drawn to beauty and drawn to different things that they were naming as what they aspired to. They had the concrete, I want to be, you know, this person, I want to get this education, I want to marry X or whatever it was, but they were also, but I wanted, like they were very aware of putting it together in a way that attended to the beauty of what they were narrating. So they wanted their lives to be beautiful. They wanted them to be these creative works of God that they could see were fearfully and wonderfully made by God and things like that. So, but interesting, I'm glad that you raised that up. No.
I can say, I just want to shout out my barber, Sir Milda Barber, who's just absolutely incredible. And so, yeah, I feel that. But on the real, like going to the barbershop for me has often been like a sanctuary kind of space, very complicated sanctuary space, the patriarchy and the sexism, the misogyny, the queerphobia, all that. And at the same time, it's a space where I feel like I could be fully Black and beautiful. And there's something about, I think, naming the beauty that is Blackness that's also theological, and thinking about Cone and other womenist and feminist theologians who are pushing for that, I think is very important. And I was also just thinking about making a distinction perhaps between beauty and like attraction, especially with young people, and really trying to elaborate on what that distinction might look like. And I think that's very important because beauty, to me, it sort of flows from within and goes out. So if you have an ugly spirit, then I really, you know, how good looking you are. So there's a way I think I would like to think through that distinction.
Hi, my name is Grace Clark Johnson, and I don't work in any youth capacity at all. But I sit on boards that work with youth, and I've been in church pretty much all my life, and I've served in my church, and so have my children. And so my question, I'm kind of trying to figure out how to answer the question. So many children have been so traumatized by the church, disengaged. They have no respect for the church at all. And now you spoke a little bit that you have taken unchurched people and you started some activism with them. But how do you re-engage those young people who, if they hear the word church, because they've been in church all of their life, PK kids, the whole nine, how do you re-engage them back into the church, back into activism? How do you reconnect with them?
So Skip is gonna like never let me speak again. Good thing it's the last lecture. I'm not actually sure I want to if the church stays exactly as it is. Because there's so much harm that gets done and damage to youth and young adults and children in the name of God in churches as it currently is that I may not actually want to send them to some places. I've had young people ask me, is it safe for me to go there? And I will tell them honestly, no, that's not the place for you. Let me find you somewhere else. We're gonna find you a community if you're looking, but that one's not it. So the reality is it's a both and kind of question. So in order to fully respond to that question, I might also want us to wrestle with what might the church need to look like in order to prepare to receive the young people who want to be there. And so, I mean, that's a complicated and much needed discussion and conversation, but it's much longer than this Q&A can allow for. But part of it really is, do we actually have spaces that want young people? Because most of the churches I know, when they talk about the crises of youth and things like that, are really just in membership crises. They may not actually want young people, and they may not actually want to be the safe spaces where young people, if they fully contribute, because when they fully contribute, they will disrupt some things, want to allow them to disrupt the way it's always been done. But so that's as real as I can respond to that. I think the other side, because you asked another question of like, how do we engage them both in churches or re-engage them in activism? The activism is a much easier sell. And the reason I say that is because often they're waiting for opportunities for you, well, not even waiting, they're creating their own opportunities to make a difference, to kind of see a situation, and with just a few clicks or a few kind of motivations can often go. Like I remember just putting out some information one time to a bunch of young people and saying, this is something we're working on. They were like, we're working on it for the future, we're working on it for right now. I'm like, well, the event is happening soon, so if you want it, they're like, we're there. And so it wasn't as much. Now, it's a different conversation if you're asking about how we get young people to maintain or move from activism to organizing, where they maintain kind of connections and build the institutions or the organizations that then will sustain some stuff. But those are different questions. I know you've got comments and thoughts.
No, that was everything. So that was great. The only thing that came to mind for me is I have a friend and a colleague, Ahmad Green, who's also at Princeton University, graduated from PTS, who did this event. I think it was called From the Pew to the Pulpit. And the event was really around sexual violence amongst children in the church. But it was also sort of more broadly around trauma that young people experience in the church. And he can speak a lot better to it. But one thing that I'm thinking in light of his work is the church needs to apologize. Not a fake sorry in order to get the membership and all that stuff. But I mean, like, you can't restore a relationship. If I do something wrong in the relationship and I try to sweep it under the rug and then be like, but why you don't come home no more? I mean, you ain't even apologized. I mean, really, like, you didn't sit with it. So a part of what it could look like, and I would ask you to really look up Brother Ahmad Green's work, is to sort of call on our churches to have some serious reconciliation that begins with apologizing. And that will also show, do you know what you're apologizing for? You know, you get information from people's apologies. Like, that wasn't even it. So, yeah.
This will be our final question.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk today, both of you. You had mentioned about, I have young children, 11 and 8, and at times I think they're kind of getting it as far as social activism and caring about the world, and at other times I see a spoiled child in front of me and I'm like, where did she come from? So I'm curious if you have any specific resources about chores and things like that that are, up-to-date expectations that we can implement to ensure that we're really kind of building children that are contributory to our world.
I personally, off the top of my head, don't have those up-to-date resources, but I know that Carolyn can help you find them. So, but part of it also, and this is the thing that there's been for years in like parenting guides and medical circles, like questions around it, and they've sometimes are great resources and sometimes are not. But I think part of it is whatever the culture, or actually the type of skills and values you want to nurture in your young people, you have to kind of make it the culture carte blanche. And so that's the thing that we've wrestled with in my family, but also just really trying to think through practically what does this look like. And of course, it also sometimes means countering many of the expectations from the broader society or even from schools, where it's like, kid barely has enough time to finish the extra homework that they now have or make it to soccer practice on time or things like that, let alone volunteer or go or clean up, certain things that are not just their room, but something that's going to affect the family. But I mean, simple things that I've read most recently are around what does it look like for them to contribute to like communal meals or contribute to cleanup after communal meals and things like that, so that it actually is family time, but it's also responsibility that if you don't chop these apples, then we can't have this apple walnut salad, if you or whatever it might be. And I remember even when I was teaching middle school, one of the rites of passage projects that we would do for our sixth graders was that they actually had a big list of things that they had to accomplish in order to go through the rites of passage. And this is a public school program. And something as simple as taking public transportation by themselves, so looking at their agency, but preparing a meal for their family. It could be a simple thing like grilled cheese, or it could be a simple, but they had to go through the steps of creating the list, figuring out the menu, buying the groceries, cooking, putting it on the table, and cleaning up as one of the things that they had to do that their parents signed off on and that helped them as they moved collectively with their group of fellow sixth graders through what it meant to now transition into the big people world of seventh grade and middle school. And so it was this interesting thing that we would do, and they embraced it fully. Some kids were like, can I just do peanut butter and jelly? Be like, I think you've been making peanut butter and jelly for a long time. What do your folks want to eat? They had to consider, and never probably having done this before, the needs of the rest of their family. Wait a minute, we're all kind of picky eaters. Will mom eat what I've decided? Will dad eat what I've, and so having to do that just in the creation of a menu and a meal. That was like a big culminating thing, but most of the parents also spoke about what then it meant, because now they also, on some sides, they were like, now I have someone who thinks they're a budding chef, and they have a say about everything I cook now, because they think they can do it better. But on the other side, that they were now contributing in particular and specific ways based on the skills that they had to cultivate for this one big project. And so I can look back and try to share what else was on that list for our rites of passage, but it required a few basic things like doing a load of laundry, or that they needed to be able to say that they knew how to do, even if it wasn't something they did on a regular basis, so that they would see that this is how they contribute, these are the things that make our house work, and things like that.
Would you please join me in thanking our presenters for today?